At the time of recording this video, I've hit a lot of snags with my editor regarding the content of my next book. The short of it is that, while my first book would probably be appropriate for an 8th grader, if that 8th grader read at the reading level of a high schooler, this next book isn't appropriate for anyone under the age of 14. Even then, some of the stuff teeters closer to an R rating. This is due to the fact that I show more of what life is like in Kemet in this book. If you don't remember, Kemet is the nation in real-world Egypt run by a bunch of totalitarian liches in a police state, where the police are supported by flesh-eating zombies. Fantastic elements aside, I spent a lot of time researching real-world totalitarian states and showing what life is like under that kind of regime. It's not fun for anybody, but it's especially bad if you're a young, attractive woman. You can guess why. I tiptoe around what that entails in the book and never actually show it, but even then, my editor got upset with the implications. The Tomb Lords restrict what people can spend their income on by requiring everyone to be paid in coupons, which can only be redeemed for specific things. If you're trying to buy food, you can only use food coupons. If you want to buy shoes, you have to spend luxury good coupons. This is how the liches try to control what people can buy or sell, but like real-world regimes that have tried this, it ends in people trying to barter for what they need. And while this is illegal and can get you eaten alive by zombies, that threat only works if you aren't already about to die of starvation. And a lot of times, young women have only one thing in a country like this to bargain with. Meanwhile, the military police are basically empowered to do whatever they want and can simply point at a person and declare them a traitor or a spy with no evidence. Guess what happens if the military policeman thinks a girl is hot? In a country like this, you're not allowed to defend yourself from the government, so how do you think this plays out? And I include this stuff because I believe it's important for people to understand how societies like this have worked and still work today, in some parts of the world. But the response I get from my editor is that the darkness in your work reflects on the darkness in you. To which I thought, really? You think every time someone accurately portrays a dark reality of life, it reflects on something negative on the part of the writer? Now, obviously, there are times when an author is inserting dark and edgy content that's purely gratuitous. This can be with excessive gore that serves no real purpose, or it can be with lewd content that's not exactly consensual, that's just there as fan service. And it does need to be said that there is an audience for that kind of material. I personally did not like the amount of gore in the Fallout TV series. It's a bit more than anything in the video games. Cooper cannibalizing another ghoul when he can literally eat any radioactive food without consequence, and it's shown earlier in that same episode that he drinks radioactive water all the time, is a prime example of this. Now, you can argue the point of this was to show Cooper's character, and it does feel like he's doing this more to mess with Lucy than out of an actual need. Cooper wants to bring Lucy down to his level, and you get the sense that maybe Cooper secretly hates what he's become, and wants to prove to himself that everyone would be like him given enough time in the wasteland. The same cannot be said for anything involving Thaddeus's foot. That was just gross for the sake of it. Now, some people enjoy that sort of thing. That's the funny thing about gratuitous sex and violence. It's a form of fan service, and some fans like the service. If you're working on a book aimed at adults, or an R-rated movie or show, and this is the kind of audience you're going for, well, go to town, I guess. It's not my cup of tea, but that's just it. It's a matter of taste. The real problem comes when you're working with a particularly grim subject that's not just there for the hell of it. When you're trying to tell a story about someone dealing with something horrible, or you want to include grim subject matter for educational purposes. The entertainment isn't just from watching the gore or the essay, but from watching people fight against the circumstances that bring these things about. There is a line of thinking that some people have that such things should never be shown on screen at all. This is that matter of taste thing, but in reverse. But the problem I have with this opinion is that it basically eliminates half the point of art in the first place. One of the best things about fiction is being able to look at real-world issues or problems through the veil of fantasy. It's a way of shielding the author with plausible deniability in case any of the people depicted are the sort who will make people disappear when someone offends them. To give you an idea what I mean, I want to tell you a little story about Sigmund Freud. In the late 19th century, Freud was working on studying hysteria, which, at the time, was a series of disorders that modern medicine divides into a number of different conditions today. For example, it's now understood that if a patient has syphilis and the disease has started to affect their brain, we don't call it hysteria, we call it a symptom of syphilis. But the primary issues Freud studied were physical behaviors and ungovernable emotional outbursts that had no known medical cause. These types of hysteria are now classified as a form of PTSD. You may have been told that hysteria at this time was literally just Victorian society forgetting what women were and diagnosing every woman who wouldn't fall in line with social expectations. There's probably a kernel of truth in that somewhere, but the reality discovered by Freud was much, much worse. If anything, the depiction of hysteria as some form of misogyny appears to have been part of a cover-up for the horrors that were actually going on at the time. For starters, Freud tried to find as many male patients to run experiments on as he did women, just to be thorough on getting to the bottom of what was causing the symptoms. Male hysteria patients had a tendency to be overlooked more than women. It was more common for their symptoms to manifest in quieter ways, such as retreating inward and avoiding people instead of having more visible outbursts like women. Additionally, male patients who weren't born into wealthier families usually just ended up homeless and forgotten, whereas female patients were still valued for marriage. She didn't have to be sane in order to give birth. Make of that what you will. Bottom line, people thought hysteria was a women's disease because they were mostly keeping track of female patients and ignoring the men. But Freud still analyzed 6 men along with 12 women, which was about as thorough of a study as one could do back then with the resources available. What Freud discovered, which he published in 1895 as the essay Studies on Hysteria, was that each of his patients reported being abused as a child. And by abused, I mean SA'd, usually by a parent or a family member. In his essay, which you should Google if you want to check my sources, Freud noted that not only had each of these patients been abused as a child, but they were expected, even required, to keep quiet about it, and were surrounded at all times by people who knew about all of this but could act and smile like nothing was wrong. The hysteria symptoms were, in effect, the result of having to keep this dark secret bottled up until the patient couldn't take it anymore. And what Freud discovered was that being able to open up and discuss their childhood sexual trauma made the symptoms lessen, and in some cases go away altogether, at least for a while. Freud published his findings as the seduction theory, which has a misleading name and basically meant kids who were SA'd become hysterical adults, which resulted in every parent of his patients basically demanding that the scientific community label Freud a quack. I'll let you take a guess as to why the parents of these patients, whom Freud said were abused by their parents, would react this way. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, a sexologist who was present at a public reading of this essay in Vienna at the time, declared it a scientific fairy tale. Basically, Freud almost lost his entire career. And that's why he published a retraction of seduction theory in 1905 and replaced it with his new theory, the Oedipus complex. The Cliff Notes version is that Freud said all 18 of his patients were claiming that they were abused, but he didn't actually believe it happened, and they had just imagined or fantasized about their parents SAing them because they secretly wanted that to happen. Everybody today seems to know that Freud made up the Oedipus complex. They just don't seem to know why he made it up, or why the public reaction to this theory was so positive at first. It wasn't just early 20th century people being dumb. They liked it because it covered up the scandal that his previous theory had revealed. This is also the reason why lobotomies became as common as they were in the early 20th century. People sometimes refer to a lobotomy that turned a patient into a vegetable as a botched lobotomy. No. By that definition, all lobotomies are botched. Everyone knew that this procedure, which became the go-to treatment for most people with this condition from the 40s to the 50s, turned hysteria patients into coma patients. The reality is that lobotomies were popular among the parents of hysteria patients because they kept victims of child abuse quiet about what their parents did to them. Now, we can think whatever we want to about Freud, because there's no way he actually believed that all of these hysteria patients were just making up the abuse because they secretly wanted it to happen. We can accuse him of betraying his patients, of selling out, catering to the mob, whatever you like. But the fact remains that when he tried to publish the truth about his subject, he almost lost his entire career. His research very likely would have been buried in the sea of essays and papers that were published at the time. I mean, do you have any idea how many research papers get published per year? You think the vast majority of them ever get read at all? Especially the ones that the greater scientific community have labeled quackery? And this is why Freud should have been a fantasy writer in his spare time, because he could have disguised his findings on childhood essay as some sort of work of fiction, where the subject matter is carefully hidden behind fantastical elements. Something like, I don't know, a story about a little girl and her robot boy buddy exploring Uncle Lovecraft's fun-time murder hole to look for the girl's mother at the bottom? Fortunately, that anime already exists, and it's called Made in Abyss. And if you're watching on Rumble, you get to see clips of this show. Everyone on YouTube is going to have to keep watching the adventures of Stabby McGee, who had to move to the Commonwealth because New Vegas can't run on my computer anymore due to the sheer amount of bugs. Made in Abyss gets accused frequently of sexualizing its child protagonists. The only thing I can say to this is that the people making these accusations probably haven't watched the show. While it is true that a number of adult characters have shown a lack of respect for any kind of privacy or boundaries for both Reg, the robot boy, and Rika, the audience doesn't get to see anything. In Rika's case, it appears that the orphanage she was raised in used humiliation and abuse that borders on SA as a form of punishment. For Reg, the fact that he's a robot with a fully functioning go-go gadget is commented on by Haybalg and especially Rika, both of whom act like his privacy is not worth considering. On one hand, this could be because Haybalg and Rika don't recognize Reg as a person, instead thinking of him as an artifact of the Abyss. Rika even named him after her dog. But in Rika's case, it could very well be a sign that she's been raised in an environment where that's how the adults have treated her, and she now thinks it's normal. But the character that really stands out as a potential metaphor for child abuse has got to be Bondrewd the novel. Bondrewd is probably one of the best villains in all of fiction, definitely in the top 100 of all time. He looks like he could be a Darth Vader clone at first, and when we see what he does to kids in his experiments, it's easy to hate him. Throw in his powers and gadgets and you have a memorable villain on par with some of the greatest bad guys of all time. But the scariest things about Bondrewd aren't his power level, or his design, or even the things he's done in his experiments. It's his personality. He's affable, charismatic, and even seems to genuinely love the children he adopts. He just doesn't seem to understand why the cruel experiments he subjects them to are wrong. Supposedly, Bondrewd is based in part off of Joseph Mengele, the Doctor of Death of the Holocaust. I don't know if that's actually true, because while they both conducted horrific atrocities on children, the similarities end there. I'm pretty sure Mengele didn't test every one of his experiments on himself before trying them out on his victims. There is not a single terrifying experiment that Bondrewd tests on the children he adopts that he has not already tested on himself. And his entire mindset is basically, I went through all of this and I turned out fine. Now get in the elevator and let me turn you into a furry. If you're lucky. This is eerily similar to how a lot of child abuse was perpetrated throughout the world for most of human history. It wasn't just that the parents abused their children, it's that they were imitating the abuse they suffered when they were children. Most fans of the movie Cuties didn't just wake up one morning and decide that was something they wanted to do to kids. They were once victims themselves who normalized the abuse to the point that they became the next abusers.
It's just like, werewolf rules?
And of all of Bondrewd's victims, the character we get to know the most is Nanachi, who I'll be referring to here as female even though I don't actually know and different translations don't make it clear. After being turned into a rabbit-like creature called a hollow, Nanachi ends up working with Bondrewd as a lab assistant for years, all in the hopes that she can one day help her friend Mitty, who is turned into a flesh blob. And as soon as she finally escapes Bondrewd, she turns into him. Nanachi started her own experiments on Delvers. She continues experimenting on Mitty to try and find a way to mercy kill her. She was about ready to let Rika die if Reg hadn't reminded her of how Nanachi cares for Mitty, implying she's let other Delvers die in the fourth layer of the Abyss before. During the Idlefront arc, Nanachi is constantly facing PTSD-induced breakdowns, partly based on what was done to her, but also because of what she did to other children on Bondrewd's behalf. And she almost relapses and goes back to work for him just so he'll leave Reg and Rika alone. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is the only way to interpret this show, nor am I going to claim that I know for a fact that this is something the creators of the manga thought about when they were making it. There are many other ways you could interpret this story, especially with the context of Japanese culture, which has its own issues with older generations forcing abusive traditions onto the youth, and holding them to a standard the elderly claim to have followed, but had a number of hidden advantages like being born in the post-war economy, and not having a massive government retirement fund crushing down on them like the Japanese youth of today. And of course, you're not allowed to criticize your elders in Japanese society. That's disrespectful. But that's the thing about writing a fantasy series and weaving real-life messages and themes into a story. To quote Futurama, if you do things right, people will wonder if you've done anything at all. And in the end, if the solutions that the story proposes can be applied to real life, that's what ultimately matters. Nanachi doesn't kill Bondrewd. The characters don't find some magic way to bring him to justice. but they escape. Nanachi joins Rika and Reg on their quest deeper into the abyss, and she leaves this man behind, saying goodbye to his cruel experiments and following companions who can keep her from falling back into the methods he taught her. And that's enough. For a victim of abuse, escape is a victory. Sometimes, breaking the cycle is enough. This is a form of self-censorship. Hiding something behind fantastical elements because it would get you in trouble if you addressed it directly. Of course, not every story has the luxury or the necessity of being able to hide things behind a shroud of fiction. Sometimes, there's no way to accurately portray things in your story without dressing it up to look like something fantastic. This is especially true if you're trying to do a historical drama, or a piece that takes place under conditions similar to a period in the real world, such as the Middle Ages. One manga that I particularly appreciate for this, among other things, is Berserk. Berserk is a great manga with sadly no good anime adaptation that has so many good things going for it, I could be talking about it all day. But for the purposes of this video, the thing that always sticks out to me is the accurate portrayal of how women were treated in medieval Europe. Life wasn't great for most people back then. Life was pretty awful most of the time. But a lot of modern media in America likes to gloss over some of these realities, unless they're trying to make a particular point. The fate of most women in a village that was conquered by a rival nation isn't usually shown in Western media. And for the most part, it isn't really shown too much in Berserk. It's just alluded to. Yeah, it's a little graphic for a few panels, in that there is a few women who are not fully dressed, but that's as bad as it gets regarding this issue. In a manga about horrific demons and existential horror, the issue of being a woman in this setting is very rarely shown in full detail. There is one exception, but even that is shown less to titillate fans and more to show how depraved the villain is. I'm trying to avoid spoilers if you couldn't tell. And yes, I am aware of the issue with the trolls. That's a bit more in the later chapters. I honestly think that series like this are important, because here in America, we've kind of forgotten, perhaps deliberately, that this used to be the norm, not the exception. Men of a conquered nation were taken as labor slaves, and women were taken as, well, sex slaves. That wasn't just in Europe, either. If there's one thing about the US military that I'm actually proud of, it's the fact that the American military doesn't allow its soldiers to do this to the women of the nations we occupy, and has had policies about this since before the First World War. Some of the nations that are under US occupation right now would not extend the same grace if they were to invade another country. Heck, there are people in Japan and China who are old enough to remember what the Japanese did to Nanking during World War II. They might be geriatric, but these events are still technically within living memory. Even if the Japanese wouldn't do something like that now, the fact remains that that's a relatively recent development. But perhaps the best example of a work that had to avoid hiding its dark content, based on real historical events that happened in the last century, is The Death of Stalin. First a graphic novel, then adapted as a movie in 2017, this is hands down one of the funniest movies I've ever seen, and one of the most horrific. The film has plenty of genuinely funny moments, like early in the film when Stalin has had a heart attack and they're trying to find a doctor who can save him.
All right, comrades, now that we're quarried, I propose we call a doctor.
All the best doctors are in the gulag, or dead.
Yes, because they tried to kill the boss.
So any doctor still in Moscow is not a good doctor.
What are people's thoughts on getting a bad doctor?
What the fuck are you talking about? That's mad. What if he recovers and finds out? Well, if he recovers, then we got a good doctor. And if he doesn't recover, then we didn't, but he won't know.
And it's also genuinely horrifying, because everyone in Stalin's cabinet was a complete monster. And the portrayal of Lavrentia Beria's trial is fairly accurate to what we know about the man's death in real life. They never show any of the women or girls being abused. They get close enough to show you that's happening and how he uses his position to threaten people with being sent to a gulag if his victims don't submit, but the film does its best to keep the deed off screen.
George,
Read it, here's your trial.
Spit it out, will you? Please,
Marshal,
Comrade General Secretary, stop with it! You're judging me! You're judging me! I judge you! I judge you! I judge all of you! All of you! Where's the logic?
Nicky, read it.
Where's the logic? Where is
Would you
the
like me to
argument,
read it for
please?
you?
Come on, you pig! Where's the argument?
You are accused of using your position as Minister of the Interior to plot against the Soviet Union with the goal of forwarding the interests of foreign powers.
Pass me from the fucking moon!
You are also accused of 347 counts of sexual deviance, bourgeois immorality, and acts of perversion with children as young as 7 years old.
And Beria is also absolutely correct when he points out that the other members of the cabinet are just as guilty of the same crimes. Now, this film is primarily based on historical events. Some liberties were taken to make the film work as a movie, like the fact that Beria wasn't tried or executed in real life until several months after Stalin's actual death. But other than things like that, this is a depiction of real-world events, made in part to show people what life in the Soviet Union was actually like for people living in Moscow, and showing what kind of person can brown-nose their way up into Stalin's cabinet. It's educational. And the question I've run into is, how much should we censor our works that are meant to be educational so as to avoid showing the grittier, scarier parts of history? Most of history is not G-rated. Most of life today is not G-rated. So where do we draw the line? Even YouTube can't answer that question, which is why I had to edit that last clip, and why I keep having to say things like SA. And this is a big problem for me because my next book is going to focus more on what life is like in Kemet. You know that region in Heroes of Shannon that's built on top of real-world Egypt and ruled by a bunch of liches? Yeah, you're going to get to see more of what life is like there in the new book when it comes out. You're going to get to see how Amenhotep's police state works. And yeah, Amenhotep and his cabinet are all a bunch of skeletal mummies whose gonads rotted off of them millennia ago, so they're not going to be doing the same stuff Beria was up to, but the necrophytes, whom you didn't get to see in the first book because they had to be cut to keep the book shorter, necrophytes are humans that Amenhotep empowers to command some of his undead minions to patrol the nation and ensure obedience, because you can't just have a zombie police force. You need at least one thinking person each patrol. Those guys are just as human as the KGB, and Amenhotep uses very similar tactics to keep them obedient. My previous book was acceptable for 7th and 8th graders, but try as I might, I couldn't make this one appropriate for anyone who isn't in high school yet. 9th graders? Fine. 8th graders? No, probably not. And you might be thinking, well, Sam, just don't include this sort of thing in a high school age story. Keep teenagers sheltered away from the details about how real-world evil works. Just make the bad guy a noseless wizard with dark magic powered by ground-up unicorns or something. The death of Stalin has an R rating for a reason. Leave that sort of thing for the adults. But the problem with that is that it leaves the most impressionable people in the world without access to any sort of education about the kinds of people who prey on the youth to gain power in the first place. Why do you think socialism is more popular with young people? There's a lot of reasons, but part of it is because young people are impressionable and will be swayed by demagogues unless they're taught early enough to watch out for them, and how socialism actually plays out in real life. I don't have a set answer for when and where we can draw a bright line in the sand and say, this is the part where you need to censor. I know some things, particularly true things, shouldn't be kept away from young people, including teenagers. But the question there is, how much to show? I'm open to advice from the comments below because this is a tricky question that I know I can't answer entirely by myself. I also want to show you the new cover art we have for the upcoming book. Progress is still being made. Slowly, but we're getting there. I've gotten far enough with my editor that I can start feeding chapters to my beta readers, so we're going to get this thing moving as fast as we can. That's all for today. Thank you, and goodbye.